Welcome to our GSBA Thought Leadership Session, Leading with Executive Function. I am Sucheta Kamath, CEO and founder of ExQ. Today, we are sharing a sneak peek of an upcoming episode of Full PreFrontal, our weekly podcast dedicated to exposing the mysteries of executive function. During this episode, I interview a special guest, Dr. Ethan Kross, one of the world's leading experts on controlling the conscious mind and an award winning professor at the University of Michigan and the Ross School of Business. His work has focused on self talk or conversations we have with ourselves, which shape our lives and our well being. We will discuss Dr. Kross's new book, Chatter, and its link to executive function in our lives and practical strategies for learning and teaching how to harness this universal inner voice to help us achieve our goals. Listen and learn about the voice in our head, why it matters, and how to harness it for our students and ourselves. Welcome to Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. This podcast is fueled by three goals. One, to explain what executive function is, what's the role of prefrontal cortex in self-actualization, and we do that by translating research and finding the overlap and intersectionality between neuroscience, psychology, rehabilitation, anthropology, and many, many other fields. Number two, we hope to help connect the plight of the current self with the needs of the future self and bridge the gap between the two. And the third goal is to really help people create a playbook for personal success. And that personal success can come from mastering executive function. And one such big barrier to self-actualization is mental chatter. Well, we have Dr. Ethan Kross today with us, who is one of the world's leading experts on controlling the conscious mind. He's an award-winning professor at the University of Michigan and the Ross School of Business, and he is the director of the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory. He has participated in policy discussion at the White House and has been interviewed on CBS Evening News, Good Morning America, Anderson Cooper's Full Circle, and NPR's Morning Edition. His pioneering research has been featured in New York Times, The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, and many, many places. But the most important thing, thank God he did it for us, is this amazing book called Chatter. So welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great.
Let's begin with what you're most well known for, the concept of mental chatter, and actually even self-control. But you write that the thoughts racing through the mind is like a horrible carnival ride one cannot get off. I love that description. So tell us what one should understand other than the obvious nature of the words mental chatter. How would you describe it scientifically? And tell us about the helpfulness of it as well as the harmfulness of it.
Well, when we're talking about, we're fundamentally talking about self-talk, or what is often colloquially referred to as our inner voice. And what scientists mean when they use those terms is that we're talking about our ability to use language silently. So we're very familiar with the concept of talking to other people using words, but as you know very well from your own work, we often talk to ourselves in words too. We think in words. Now, that's not to say that thoughts equal words. We can think to ourselves in images as well. But a lot of our private mental life, a lot of our private mental experiences deal with words. Now, this ability to silently use language, this is an amazing tool that you wouldn't want to live life without, because self-talk allows us to do a number of remarkable things. Just to give you a few concrete examples, if I were to ask you to repeat in your head, I love Atlanta, I love Atlanta, I love Atlanta. I know you live there. So, just repeat that phrase in your head silently. You'd be using your inner voice. Our inner voice is part of what we call our verbal working memory system. This is a mental system that allows us to keep information active in our heads, and which is absolutely essential to our ability to successfully navigate the world. Try going to a grocery store and without this verbal memory system, working memory system, it'd be really hard for you to remember what you went there to buy. So I often will get to the grocery store and think to myself, what do I have to get? Eggs, cheese sticks, yogurt. You repeat that. That's your working memory. So that's one thing that our inner voice lets us do. But our inner voice lets us do other things as well, like simulate and plan for the future. So when I'm preparing for a presentation, I'll often rehearse in my head what I'm going to say. That's your inner voice. And your inner voice also lets you come up with stories to explain our experiences. So when bad things happen, like we experience loss or we're rejected or we get angry, we often try to turn our attention inward to make sense of those experiences, and we use language to help us do that. So that's all your inner voice. Lots of great things come of it. There is a dark side to this inner voice, though, which is what chatter is all about. And what chatter is the following. We experience something negative in our lives, and we reflexively try to use language to make sense of that experience, to work through it. But we don't just come up with a clear explanation that allows us to move on. Instead, we end up ruminating and worrying and catastrophizing. We get stuck in these negative thought loops that take this remarkable capacity, language, and it turns it into a curse rather than a blessing, because we end up suffering. We end up having difficulty focusing on what we're trying to do because it can consume our executive resources, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. We know that chatter can create friction in our relationships and also impact our physical health negatively. So it's a huge problem, and it's one that I've devoted my career towards trying to address. And the upshot, the good news, is that we've learned that there are a number, 2 or 3 dozen science-based tools that people can use to manage their chatter. And so there really is a positive conclusion to this story, and that's really the full terrain.
And one thing I must say, what I loved about there would have been so many ways you could have told the story of your research. And I love that you framed it from chatter perspective. Number one, I think, as you mentioned, the universality of that experience. When I talk about executive function, it's sometimes lost on people because they may not know the terms, complex terms such as executive function or executive functioning. But chatter, they're like, yes, I know exactly what that is. And the second part I think I really love is this idea that it has such potency, that we not only are using this to guide our actions, but it is a mental tape recorder that can actually allow us to replay something in order to manage the load of information. So can you, let's slice this up into many parts. The first part I would love to talk about is role of attention and its relationship, or rather relationship between attention and chatter or self-directed speech.
Well, there are 2 ways that attention factors into chatter at the broadest level. One way it does so is when we experience chatter, when we're worrying or ruminating, that leads us to really narrow our attention on what the source of our troubles are or is. So we zoom in a very tunnel vision-like manner. And that can be problematic when it comes to performing complex routines or habits. So, in the book, I tell the story of a pitcher who really threw a wild pitch, started experiencing some chatter. Oh my God, I just threw a wild pitch. And what ended up happening is his chatter ended up leading his pitching windup, which he had spent years and years refining, right? Putting all of these individual steps together to make this wonderful, complex symphony of movements, like throwing the ball to home in baseball. Chatter caused that complex habit to unravel by focusing his attention on the individual components of the habit. So what makes a complex habit effective is that you don't have to think about the individual elements, right? Like when a professional pitcher goes on the mound, he doesn't have to think about how high he should lift his knee or how far back he should, pull his arm before releasing the ball or how tightly he should squeeze the ball. He just does those things automatically without thinking, and it works. And practice allows the pitcher to be able to do that. if you start having a picture scrutinize the individual components of that habit, what that leads is the whole thing to blow up. So if you start thinking, oh my God, am I squeezing the ball tight enough? And am I releasing it properly? That leads to something we call paralysis by analysis. It's all about attention. We're hyper-focusing the attention on the individual components, and it can make performing under stress really, really hard to do. So that's one way that chatter and attention are related. The other way that they're related is chatter can consume our attentional resources. So when we're experiencing chatter, when we're worrying or ruminating about something, it's like there's nothing else exists in the world. And even if we're aware that there are other things we need to do, we have trouble focusing on them. The real world example I like to give people is to think about a time when they tried to read a few pages in a book when they were consumed with a worrisome thought. Most people report having this experience, and when they do, they read several pages only to get to the end and realize they don't know what they've just read. They can't remember anything because they haven't actually encoded or processed the material. That's because their attention was focused on the chatter, not on what they were actually trying to do, their goal of reading the book.
My work with rehabilitation, cognitive retraining, is about identifying the internal, we used to call them internal and external distractions. So the internal distractions can be of three kinds. The thinking about your thinking. So if you're doing actual problem solving, you need some thinking, applying principles of problem solving. Second is ruminating, and third is fast forwarding, living in fantasy. You're either doing that mental time travel, going forward or backward, and then you're actually consumed. So what you're saying is that attention management really requires chatter management. And if you don't have that understanding how much interference the chatter can cause, you might be victim of your own mental chatter, because it can keep you very busy, right?
Well, I think, this is, a matter of semantics, and people define words differently. That's science, right? We have these, we are always very clear in how we define a word. I equate chatter with negativity. So to me, there are healthy and harmful ways of talking to ourselves, healthy versus harmful self-talk or self-directed speech. And chatter is the term I use to capture the harmful variant of that. And so once you're in chatter territory, from my perspective, it's time to take efforts to minimize it and redirect the conversation. Now, to be clear, just not any kind of negative self-talk is synonymous with chatter. So let me describe what I mean by that. I'm a proponent of the idea that negative emotions are functional. They are beneficial to us in small doses. So when I experience a ping of anxiety when I think about an upcoming presentation, really, really useful emotional response, because it mobilizes me to begin preparing for that event that I have coming up. Okay, well, now it's time to do some work. If I experience a little bit of anger when someone transgresses me in some way, that's a good thing. I'm preparing for how to engage with this person. So I think we evolve the capacity to experience negative emotions for a reason. What makes negative emotions harmful is when they're prolonged. When we don't just experience a little burst of negativity and then move on with our lives, but rather when we get stuck, re-experience those negative emotions over and over and over again. And that's what chatter is all about.
And I really thank you for drawing the distinction there, because I think we often look inwards, and you write about this, and we're looking for inner coach to guide through this problem solving, but we may meet an inner critic, and that critic may trip us. So how do you study this in your lab? How do you invoke responses from people to understand the inner workings? Can you share a few experiments with us?
Well, there are lots and lots of different ways that we try to tackle this, and they range from bringing participants into the lab and having, inducing negative emotions in any number of ways. I should clarify, we induce negative emotions in the lab in the hopes of figuring out how people can better manage their emotions in life. So we don't do it just to be mean. We direct people to then think about their experiences in different ways. So one condition, if people are randomly assigned to one group, we might ask them to just think as they normally would about some of these experiences. In another strategy condition, we might test any number of different tools that we think might be useful for helping people manage their negative emotions. So those are the kinds of things we do in the lab. We'll also sometimes do these studies while we're scanning, using brain imaging technology to monitor how their brains, different networks in their brains are correlating with different ways of thinking about these experiences. We'll do studies using people's smartphones where we text message them throughout the day over several days to index how much they're ruminating about their experiences over time. We do this stuff with kids, with adults, clinical populations. So we really have a very broad toolbox of methods that we can use to study chatter and, importantly, how it can be controlled.
I think that there's so many fascinating parts of the way you even tap into that. But one of the things that you help us make the leap is how that the nature of the rant. If your internal negative talk comes out as a rant, then it acts as a social repellent. And can you share some of those findings where people who are ruminating, they actually occupy the social spaces by keep externalizing ruminating, and it can put people off, including in middle school. Children tend to talk more about their negative experiences, can have less friends. And that's so powerful to know that.
Yeah, well, when we experience chatter, we're often highly motivated to talk about it with other people. And so we find other people to share what's streaming through our heads. The problem is that because chatter is so cyclical and ongoing, what often happens is you find someone to talk to, and then you talk to them, and you keep on talking about the experience over and over and over again. And there's often a limit as to how much other people can listen to without engaging in some reciprocal form of communication. Like there's a chemistry, there's a dance that usually takes place in interpersonal communications. You ask me a couple of questions about my life, I share some stuff, I then ask you questions, and so the conversations end up being a little bit more one-sided when it's about chatter, which can be off-putting to other people. There's also another issue, which is chatter can make it harder for people to solve problems because it's consuming their attention. And so that often makes it harder for them to notice problems in the interpersonal context and fix them. So because they're so consumed with their own problems, their own self, it becomes harder to be a good conversation partner, and that can have social ramifications of the sort that I talk about in the book that are quite significant.
I love that, and I think particularly the way you have laid out the book, because it really takes us to the hopefulness of that there's ways to manage it.
There's overwhelming evidence that we are more sensitive to negative stuff than positive. Danny Kahneman won the first psychologist to win a Nobel Prize, I believe the first psychologist, for the idea of loss aversion. We're more sensitive to losses than gains. Another way of saying that is bad is stronger than good. Another famous psychologist, Roy Baumeister, popularized that phrase. So that is fairly well established.
So there are two networks, or three actually, maybe, or tell me what you think. But we have default mode network, where we kind of hang back and let our mind run loose, and during that time, a lot of this rumination or chatter can occur. But that has a very great self-referencing nature to it. We think about self, I, right? And so now we have a lot of mindfulness practices that's showing that one of the ways to get off that I-centric thinking is to kind of really bring your attention to the moment. So tell us the good news that mental chatter is totally manageable. And you'll write, oh my God, there's so many ways you show us that this is totally manageable. So let's begin with why you feel so hopeful. And you're such a good psychologist, that's why you feel hopeful. But what part makes you believe so strongly that it's manageable? And then give us the tips. How can we do it successfully?
What we know is that there are many different tools. In the book, I talk about 26 different tools, and many, people use combinations of tools, and they may use different combinations in different situations. So, I think shifting the discourse out there in the culture from just looking for single tools to looking instead at combinations of tools would be really helpful. But the reason why I'm hopeful is I know there are things that are out there that can help. I've personally benefited from these. I've seen subjects, participants in studies benefit from them. So I think there is a lot of room to be optimistic. In terms of what the tools are, what can you do on your own? Well, one type of tool involves distancing. We know that people are much better at giving advice to other people than taking your own advice. And so one simple strategy that I often rely on a lot is to try to coach myself through my problems, work through my problem. Talk to myself like I would talk to one of my best friends. What would I say to them? And actually use language to help you do this. Use your own name when you're trying to coach yourself through a problem. It's really astounding if you step back and think about this. Like, say a friend is coming to you, think for a moment about what thoughts might stream through your head of panic and self-doubt before a big presentation. People think all sorts of things that are out of touch with that. Oh my God, I'm never going to be able to do this. I'm going to suck. This is terrible. Would you ever say that to your best friend who came to you for advice about, hey, I've got this big presentation coming up. What do you think? Oh, you suck. You're terrible. You'll do terrible. We never say that. We give them advice. We try to build them up. What we've learned is that distant self-talk, using your name to coach yourself through a problem, it automatically shifts our perspective. It gets us to relate to ourselves like we're relating to another person. And that can be really helpful when it comes to chatter. So that's something you can do on your own. In terms of other people, when it comes to other people and seeking out their chatter support, the thing to keep in mind is that we often think that venting is really helpful. So the way to get over our chatter is just to express how we're feeling. Research shows that that's not the case. So venting our emotions to someone else can make us feel really close and connected to another individual. Like, it's good to know that there's someone there who cares enough about me to listen to my problems. But if all we do is vent, we don't do anything to shift the way we're thinking about our circumstances, to find solutions in ways that are ultimately needed to help us suppress our chatter. So the best kinds of conversations are ones in which you find someone who does let you talk a little bit about your emotions. It is important to express what we're feeling to a certain degree. But at a certain point in the conversation, they help you refocus. They help you broaden your perspective in ways that give you insight to new ways of thinking about your circumstances that can be useful. So I like to call these people in my life, they're my chatter advisors. And I have a few of them. And they're people I go to whenever I'm experiencing a bit of chatter. And they're really helpful for doing precisely what I just described. And then the final category, environmental tools, I find these fascinating. So many different things we could do in our environment to help us control ourselves from the outside in. One example would be organizing our spaces, cleaning, organizing. When people experience chatter, they often feel like they don't have control of their thoughts. Their thoughts are controlling them. And what we've learned is people can compensate for this experience of a lack of control by exerting control around them, by organizing. This is why so many people, when they're stressed out, reflexively turn to cleaning and organizing. There's been studies that show that actually serves a function. It helps boost our sense of self-efficacy in ways that could be really helpful. So that's an example of that last bucket. Now, those are 3 tools, 3 different categories. Each one of those categories of tools has many, many other ones. So I by no means want to suggest that these are the only 3 things you could do. Again, I talk about 26 different things. And so the upshot here is that there is a vast repertoire of things we can do to manage our chatter that science has revealed. And I think the real challenge that listeners face who are motivated to try to manage their chatter is to really start doing some self-experimenting to figure out, well, what are the unique combinations of tools that work best for me, given my own unique circumstances. There are 4 or 5 tools that I consistently rely on in my life, and they really do serve me well. But the 4 or 5 things that I rely on are very different from what my wife or best friend relies on. So I really do think it's important to find what are the cocktails that are unique to every person. And again, the good news is that science provides us with a guide for beginning to do that self experimentation.
I love all. I'm so glad that you first of all organize in these three buckets because you can remember them better because there are lots and lots of strategies. But the research in the environmental modification blew me away. I was familiar with a lot of those pieces, but the way you put them together, that was really, really helpful. Simple things, even like the recovery of patients who are facing windows, whose window
Yeah,
looks out a brick wall versus that one that looks at the lawn, or the garden, just had dramatic effects. Having a plant,
amazing.
or even
Yeah,
in nursing homes when elderly were given an opportunity to water plants, their self-agency improves. And then their well-being improves. But my favorite is, if you don't mind talking
yeah,
as we end, is this sense of awe, role of awe that plays in reducing the chatter, this feeling small. And to me, that is such an important step towards transcendence. Mental chatter to me is keeping the voice of I alive and make yourself grander than you are. And so the antidote to that
hmm
is becoming smaller in presence of something magnanimous. And do you have something that you're awe
yeah.
inspired by, or how do you practice that every day?
Yeah, so I mean, fantastic research on awe. Awe is an emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast that we have
I
trouble
love that.
explaining. So last time I experienced it recently when I watched the Mars rover land on
Oh
Mars.
yes.
Just awe-inspiring to see, this spaceship land on another planet. Uh, so we know that when people experience awe, they experience a shrinking of the self. They feel smaller in comparison to this magnificent, grand thing that they're contemplating. And with them feeling smaller, so do their worries. So it can be a truly useful environmental tool. I practice it by uh, going for walks in the local arboretum whenever I can, which are filled with beautiful hundreds-year-old trees and amazing views that are just remarkable to consider. It truly awe-inspiring. And this brings me to maybe a final point I want to emphasize. A lot, so 26 different things in the book I talk about, tools. I think some of these tools will be familiar to people in the sense that they may have stumbled on them in their lives. Figured out that doing something like going for a walk in nature makes them feel better, but not really understood why. Other tools, I think, probably weren't on the radar at all. And still others, they may have been doing the reverse. What they thought they were doing something they thought was helpful, like venting, which research suggests is actually harmful. I think the value of the science and seeing all these tools in one place is it allows us to become a lot more deliberate of how we integrate these tools in our lives. So we don't have to wait to stumble on their usage, to haphazardly find something that helps us, or through a trial and error process, weed through all the alternatives. Instead, we can see, here's a list of things we can do. Let me try doing them. Let me try doing these 2 or 3 things together, and then looking to see what effect they have. And so my invitation is for listeners to begin that process, and my hope is that it's useful.
It can help you build that inner coach and calm down the inner critic. Thank you so much for being with us and being so generous with your time and your brilliant work, and wishing you the very best. And if you love what you hear, please share it. And once again, we are here with our guest, Dr. Ethan Kross. Thank you for tuning in, and have a fabulous day, and keep coming back. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our sneak peek interview, and we are excited to invite you back at the GSBA Summer Conference portal for next 2 weeks on Thursdays for a virtual cognitive cocktail hour event where we will watch a new episode of Full Prefrontal and learn more about the value and importance of executive function for our schools, students, and ourselves. We hope you will also visit our exhibitor booth during this event to learn more about ExQ for School, a personalized digital learning curriculum and tool that empowers middle and high school students to develop self awareness and strategic thinking skills through the mastery of executive function and social emotional competence. Also, subscribe to Full Prefrontal Podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And finally, remember to join us weekly for a virtual cognitive cocktail hour right here with GSBA. And remember to BYOB. Bring your own brain.